My name is Jeremy Brewer, and I am the Senior Azure Architect at Emergent Software.
Recently, Microsoft released a new product called Azure AD Cloud Sync, which is essentially supposed to replace eventually the Azure AD Connect. But there's some differences about it, and I'd like to kind of discuss that. First, let's just discuss essentially what Azure AD Connect does. When we have an on-premise environment and we have identities that we would like to get up to our Azure AD tenant, we essentially need to use a tool called Azure AD Connect. It originally was called DirSync, and now this is the new version. And what that does essentially is it provides a one-way transmission where on-prem, we create a user account, and that user ID gets synchronized over up into our Office 365 AD. And we can also choose to do some other things, like we can have some attributes sent with it. We can synchronize password hashes. And in some circumstances, a few things will come back. So, for example, you can have password write back. Password write back essentially will go ahead and allow the user, if they change their password, say, on the Office portal, maybe logging into Teams and their password has expired, or on their Azure AD joined machine, and it writes it up to Office 365, and then it sends it down back to on-premise. But that's really about it. At this point right now, if you created a user in our Office 365 tenant, that user is going to be unique there. They call it a cloud user. It's not an actual on-premise user. So what Microsoft did is they created a new tool called Azure AD Cloud Synchronization. And this Azure AD Cloud, it's actually kind of the first step into a bidirectional conversation between your on-premise and your cloud. So what essentially you see is say you have a HR system. That's the common feature right now that's being used for this. So you have an HR system that creates the user. Now the big problem is that they want to create that user in Azure AD, but the issue here is that this is not going to write the user back down to on-premise. We have on-premise, on-prem, and this is a one-way communication originally. Okay, well, now what we're actually allowed to do with this cloud sync is this HR system can write it here. We're going to go ahead and be able to actually then have that come down and write it on premise as well. So we're going to actually be able to start utilizing a lot of our original processes where a new user or a new employee gets hired, the HR system creates that new user, it writes it to Azure, and then that's going to come down to on-premise, and then that runs a synchronization and goes back up here again. Okay, so password hashes and all the rest of that goes with that. And then, of course, that's going to allow the user to use things like Office 365. They're going to be able to use Salesforce, whatever other cloud apps that are able to utilize this sort of mechanism. Now, there's a couple things that aren't supported just yet. So I would really recommend making sure that you've taken a look at the documentation for this. A couple features like certain attributes and certain filterings aren't there. So right now, as I'm talking about it, that's kind of the case of it. But it's going to change over time. I have a feeling that this is going to be the de facto tool. Microsoft has done some other things with this tool. So one of the things is, in this case, is right now with AD Connect, you need to actually install an agent on-prem. And actually, it's really not an agent. You need to actually install the engine. This is the AD Connect engine. And that tool essentially is installed on your domain controller. There's only one of them. Okay, so you get a tool installed on one domain controller, and if you want to have it installed on multiples, you actually end up having to put this one on standby. And so there's a special mode for it. So if you actually have a failure in this particular domain controller, you can tell this one to go active, but there's a process for it. The other part is that the tool itself is pretty heavyweight. It needs SQL Express, and then as you get more objects, eventually it needs a SQL Server to run that. Um, there's a lot of things that are not dynamic about it. So, for example, when you create an object on premise, there's a 30-minute timer. It is adjustable. Password changes have like a 2-minute synchronization, not adjustable. And so it's kind of it was a good tool to start. It's a great tool now, but things are progressing. So the next thing about this then is that now what they've done essentially is instead of installing the agent here on your domain controller, what they actually are going to do is your AD, Azure AD, is going to essentially run a service, and this is actually brought to you by Service Bus. So the same tool that does like app proxy as an example. So this AD tool here running in your cloud is going to be essentially in sync with your on-premise domain controllers, or better than that, you can actually run this from any sort of application that server that has line of sight to this. So if you have a server like a utility server, this is going to be able to talk to that, and actually you're going to do 443 up to here and back, right? So then you can start trying to peel away all the stuff that's on your domain controller, right? You want to make sure that that stays as purpose-built as possible, right? We're going to try to keep this stuff off of there. So this is communicating with your domain controller. We're happy there. And then on top of that, this is actually just an agent. It's not a full-blown install. You don't have a SQL database sitting there. And then the better part, you can have multiples. So this guy will go up here as well. Now, to start, this is going to be active standby. So the active standby essentially is telling us that it's going to fail over if there's a heartbeat there. But I can have multiple. And on top of that, I can also have multiple domain force that are able to synchronize up. And so between all these different agents and everything going on, I actually have a much more resilient environment. I'm pretty happy with that. So again, I'm going to go ahead and encourage you to take a look over the documentation, see if this fits your needs. But this essentially is going to be the future of synchronization, okay, this bidirectional synchronization. So we're allowed to do hybrid environments a little better, a little bit more intelligent, a little faster. So thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or at Emergent Software. And I appreciate your time.